13, 31 through 33, and verses 44 through 52. Jesus was talking to his disciples in parables. We'll get into what a parable is exactly in a minute. So he put before them another parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds. But when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so the birds of the air come and make nests branches." And he told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven," which we would know as yeast, "which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened." And then on 44, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net, which was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, man drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into vessels, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire. Their men will weep and gnash their teeth." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A parable, the definition of a parable is a short, simple story designed to communicate a spiritual truth. And it's an analogy, it's a comparison to an example drawn from an everyday experience. Because the Lord was speaking to people who maybe weren't real learned, and sometimes, you could read the scriptures and go, "What?" And you have to read them again and read them again. And it was helpful when he could tell these people with a comparison on something that they have in their life. It's sometimes described as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. The Greek, we're going to get educated here, is parabole. Para means beside, and balo means to throw. So the idea is you throw or place something beside another thing to make a comparison. A parable then is a simple story which compares earthly matters to spiritual affairs and the spiritual truths. A parable individually generally teaches only one basic truth. It's not possible to learn the whole gospel message from one parable. One of those here was one sentence long, one verse long. They're just nuggets, as we might call it. It's not a primary source of doctrine. It just illustrates and confirms doctrine. So Jesus is the master teacher. People were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. But he used various means to impart his message, and one was to speak in parables. First, Jesus' teaching parables was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy that says, "All these things Jesus spoke unto the multitude in parables, and without a parable he spoke not unto them, that it might be fulfilled which is spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world." Because remember, Jesus had come for all. Before then, the temple teachings were for the educated and so many of the elite. And everybody else was just supposed to follow the rules because it said so, without an understanding so much. But Jesus came for all the people, especially the poor and those who didn't have power. And he taught them, this was the way he taught them. So when asked by his disciples why he was speaking to them in parables, he answered and said, because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. Believers read the parables and accept them with faith, understanding because their minds are spiritual. Unbelievers refuse to perceive and understand God's truth because their minds or hearts are hardened. So that's your basic definition of parables. Now, this particular sermon is on loan from St. Andrew's Anglican Church in Epsom, New Zealand, by way of Anne. This was her father's childhood church. And she has relatives buried in the kirkyard outside. So it's very special to Anne. And the vicar, who was Reverend Sarah Stevens Cross, was kind enough to share it. Anne heard this sermon when she was in New Zealand about a month ago. Yeah, she attended that church and brought it home. The vicar shared it with her. And it's based on writings by someone named David Lose, L-O-S-E, I don't know. And maybe, I don't know this person, but the sentiments are pretty good in here. So with prayers and apologies, I hope not, to the vicar and to Mr. Lose, I will do my best. We are reminded of the parable of the mustard seed. All we need is a little faith. And from that, God could do big things. Remember, he told the people that it's a mustard seed that grows into a giant bush and then a tree, and it will house the birds and become, part of the landscape. Just need a little faith. God can do good big things. I remember one time Sunday school years ago, I actually brought in some mustard seeds because if you've never really worked with the mustard seeds, it's kind of hard to know how little they are. They're pretty darn little. And if you've ever made pickles, you have to put mustard seeds in them. And I've managed to dump out the jar before, and I chased them for days. Very tiny around. But I remember we made a book. We put faith on one side and laminated mustard seed on the other side. That faith the size of a mustard seed is enough. But we might have missed something in this parable and in those that follow. Because the truth is that mustard was kind of weak, uncontrollable, invasive, and undesirable. Now, that kind of goes against the grain, doesn't it? Undesirable. Really, right? And the kingdom of heaven is like that. Really? Undesirable? It follows. It comes. It makes sense. There's something sneaky about each of the parables we are reading this week. Quite literally, in each parable, except perhaps the last, there seems to be some element of surprise or stealth. And our cultural association with leaven, with yeast, is we like fluffy bread. But if you remember, at the Passover, they had unleavened bread because they didn't take time for the original Passover to let the bread rise. So they had flat bread, naan, we might call it today. Pita bread, it wasn't, we like fluffy bread. So this seems like a good deal to us. What do you put leaven in it? But in that time and place, leaven would have contaminated the whole batch. If you put a bunch in, it'd make it fluffy and kind of flat. So kneading it into flour would irreparably have tainted the loaves. So she spread it out. The lady spread it out through a bigger batch. Number two, rushing out to buy a field because you know it's worth far more than the seller is aware, while perhaps shrewd, could also be considered dubious if not dishonest. That's kind of like somebody gives you change for a 20 and gives you a 20 back. Well, you could be going, oh look, I got an extra $10. Or you could say, I'm sorry, man, you gave me too much back. So you kind of look at that parable and go, well, that's not kind of right. In those days and times, people would bury their treasures, their wealth underground, so taxpayers couldn't come get it, the robbers couldn't come get it. Well, you can imagine if somebody passed away unexpectedly, it's kind of like, storing money in your house. Maybe he didn't have relatives to say, hey, your inheritance is buried in this field. But somebody surprisingly found it and went and bought the field without telling who they bought it from. You know there's a treasure out there. So yeah, it's a little dishonest over there. And yet there's a surprising joyfulness in the one who sells all to buy a precious pearl. He'd been searching for the pearl. The guy in the field, he accidentally found treasure. This person had been searching for this pearl. And he found it. And he went and he sold everything he had so he could buy it. Now, he understood why he did it, but a lot of people around him probably didn't. Really? For a pearl? Everything you owe? But when you consider the kingdom of heaven, that is worth it. So in quick succession, we have provocative parables suggesting two things. First, the gospel of God's coming kingdom is threatening before it is comforting, because it invites no half measures. You can't just sort of. You gotta commit. And that is scary. The gospel makes a claim on your whole life, not just part of it, not just I'll give you an hour on Sunday morning. The whole heart, all. The gospel of the kingdom invades our whole world and reality. It can't be contained only to your spiritual Sunday selves. Not only that, but it taints the reality we've grown to accept. Oh, I kind of like my comfort. I understand this set of problems. I don't want to go looking for others. I think we all know that. If you put a bunch of people in a room and say you can switch problems, we pretty much all would say, nah, I'll keep mine. Because you've learned to deal with them. You've adapted to them. And that's what's, when you have to give yourself over completely to something else, well, then it's like, well, wait a minute. This is unfamiliar to me. I'm not comfortable. Because if we give it all over, it taints the reality we've grown to accept. It challenges the views we've lived by, and again calls into question assumptions that have guided much of our lives in the world. All of which means that the gospel of the kingdom that Jesus proclaims and lives is truly good news only to those who are not finally satisfied with what this life has to offer. Those of us who are searching. For those who are content, selling everything to possess a single pearl, no matter how valuable, seems a lot crazy. This says a little crazy to me. I'm saying a lot crazy. How can anything be so precious as to give up everything else to possess it? But again, Jesus was telling the story in a way that the people would understand. Pearls of fine quality were from far away. Let's see, I have it here where they're from. The pearls found in the Red Sea were okay, they're close by pearls, but they had to go to the Persian Gulf in India to find the finest quality pearls. So the fact that this guy found a pearl of this quality in Judea was woo-hoo. And the people would have understood that. Because again, parables are stories set in a way with the historical context for the audience. And Jesus knew this. But to those who are dissatisfied with the status quo, with what they have been able to secure on their own, with the values, stereotypes, and prejudices of our culture, then Jesus' gospel, while still disruptive and even upsetting, nevertheless feels true and real and something worth buying at any cost. Which is perhaps why the church has always grown most quickly in those places where life is most fragile, if not threatened. Last Sunday, if you remember, Keith was talking about 9/11 and how it was such a blow to our national psyche that people who always thought they had everything in control were drawn to church, at least for a small while, to something stronger than they, more powerful than they, because everything that they thought they knew had been is about. That Jesus' gospel, while still disruptive and even upsetting, nevertheless feels real and true. When you can set yourself up with the comforts of the world and fortify the illusion that you are the master of the universe, of what value are Jesus' promises? That somehow we are in control. Well, I think everybody here at one point or another in their life, or several, have come to the very in-your-face conclusion that we are not in control. Things that we thought we had, we got this. No, you don't. Stuff happens. Tragedy happens, death happens, illness happens, job loss happens. We're not in control. And oh, what joy it is to be able to go to God in our times of need. And they don't even have to be corporate need. It's just personal. When something happens to just you, you can go to just your Jesus. The gospel, as Paul says, appears foolish in the eyes of the world, and so has little value to the self-contented, the self-made person of the age and the powerful. But to those who are perishing, whether by illness or disappointment or poverty, addiction, or the inequities of the world, or just spiritual discontent, something's not right, I just feel empty, I feel anxious. Well, I can tell you personally, I've been on my knees where there are no stairs when I thought that I couldn't go another step, when there was nothing that could take this from me, but it does. When you set yourself down before Jesus and say, I need you. Jesus' promises are still good news, indeed the best news we've heard and worth sacrificing all to embrace. These parables say a second thing as well. Faith is about seeing something others do not, seeing something that the world does not acknowledge and perhaps does not want you to see. And because of that, sight persevering, acting differently, investing in a future at which others stop. And that is true, and the world is getting more and more like that. What do you mean you went to church on Sunday? No, Sunday's for all these other things. And it's like, well, they can't say that. We're going to fire the football coach because he prayed before the game. You know, but that's the world. Because those who don't have it, they want you to not have it either. Faith, it turns out, is not about cognitive assent to doctrinal statements, but is about wholehearted embrace of a promise. It's not just about the head, but the heart. Because that's where you feel Jesus. You can know all the things. You're supposed to love with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. All of those. Because you can know them, but mostly you feel Jesus. It's not about knowledge, but about trust. The kind of trust that leads you to act and speak differently. As if you've been invited into a secret that not everyone knows. So perhaps the heart of these parables is about making a promise that God's disruptive, life-changing, and ultimately life-giving kingdom is coming. It will take some patience, trust, and perseverance to wait for it. Or we get patient, don't we? Impatient. Why not now, God? Why not now? Why do I have to wait? I don't fit now. We get real impatient. But when it comes, it will likely not be what we expect, and perhaps not what we even want. And boy, you think about what the Jews wanted and expected from the Savior that they had been told was coming. Well, it wasn't a baby in a manger with some horses and some cows. They wanted somebody riding in on a steed to overthrow the Romans, or anything other than a small helpless child. But that's what God said because God knew. And what we want, so often we pray for things that, I didn't get that, God. What's the problem? How come? I'm tired of waiting. But it wasn't what we needed. It was something else. But to those who recognize there is something more out there than the world has offered, to those who are willing to acknowledge the deep ache in their hearts for a sense of true, if elusive, joy, then it will come as more than we could have imagined and will invade, take over, and transform our lives, even here, even now. This place, this church, is where we remind each other of God's promises and point to places in our lives and the world where we catch glimpses of His presence. Have you seen these glimpses in your own life, in our congregation? I have. The person who's overcoming mental illness, who's dealing with grief and learning to go on one more step. For someone struggling with addiction or smallness of mind in order to cope with the change and challenging realities. I see God working on those in our congregation, on me. Have you seen the child who befriends the friendless, the one who finds joy in sacrifice? I've seen that here. Those who are stunningly generous, I've seen that here. The person who sees and stands with the marginalized, I have seen that here. Those who in the face of illness or fear radiate confidence and trust and utter courage in others and offers courage to others. I have seen that here. The ones who use their power or popularity to uplift others. I have seen that here. These sneaky, surprising, unexpected parables give us a chance to make the kingdom life and reality that Jesus preaches just a little more concrete by pointing us to those whose actions are perhaps inexplicable according to the logic of the world, but fully in tune with the parable promises of the kingdom. So as you commune with your friends and your fellow parishioners this week, you might like to share an example from your own life or experience. That's up to you. But God shows us the way. Jesus teaches us in simple analogies of what we know to be, to show us the bigger it is.